Venezuela had broken the US dollar sanction to deal with China through Bitcoin, and that's the real reason the US Marines captured Maduro in Caracas. But when market realized that US dollar was completely powerless against Bitcoin blockchain because their restriction failed to stop Venezuela from trading with China, and due to that Bitcoin price jumped to $94,000. But replacing the US dollar with a Bitcoin, Venezuela had built 600k Bitcoin treasury, which is even more than what the United States Treasury holds. But now what will happen to all those Bitcoin when Maduro is in US custody, and how China and Venezuela are making US dollar weak, and how this tension between Venezuela and America is going to impact your investment. We will discuss this all, but before that, please read full legal disclaimer in the description box. Now let's dive in. The mainstream media can say whatever they want that capturing of Venezuela president was right because he was corrupt. There is too much inflation in that country. Too many drugs were coming from Venezuela to US which were harming people's health. But there is one narrative that mainstream media will probably never let you know, that Venezuela had become the threat to the US dollar future. Venezuela is not just any other country. It's alone on the 17% of the world oil reserve, which is the largest in the world. They have 303 billion barrels of oil, which is worth $18 billion. And because of having so much oil, Venezuela friendship with Russia and China started growing, and they were selling 80% of its crude oil to China. And for this selling process, they were not using US dollar, they were using crypto USDT. And there is huge difference between these two, because in US dollar, US government have full control over US dollar and it can impose sanction and freeze your account, but they can't do anything to USDT. But why does Venezuela shifted from selling oil transaction from US dollar to Bitcoin, and how they are holding 600k Bitcoin? I will explain this in a minute, but first look at this Venezuela government oil company PDVSA and how they started using US dollar for oil payments. Venezuela currency is a Bolivar, and in 2018 there was hyperinflation of 1,000,000% in their country. That means if someone's salary is $100, then next day that $100 value would drop to $50, and in just few weeks it would become close to zero because inflation was insanely high. That currency had lost 99% of its value. Therefore, people stopped using Bolivar currency because it had exactly no value. But to trade or buy anything, you need some currency, right? So people started using US dollar from March 2019. But PDVSA is a company, so whatever it exports was all done in a US dollar only. But US government imposed lot of sanction on them and frozen their bank account. You can see the list of all sanctions, but these restrictions are being imposed on Venezuela because Maduro has been accused of human rights abuse, corruption and election fraud. Therefore, America imposed restriction on Venezuela so that Maduro would improve and conduct election properly. Therefore, on 17th of October 2023, US provided temporary sanction relief after Maduro signed a Barbados Agreement, which is a roadmap intended to ensure free and fair election in a country. However, by April 2024, US State Department determined that this commitment were not fulfilled by Maduro. Then after that, US made a major accusation that Maduro prevented democratic opposition from registering their chosen candidate for presidency election, and Maduro didn't follow the Barbados Agreement that he signed with the USA. Therefore, US again imposed full dollar sanction on Venezuela in April 2024. And on 3rd of January 2026, the US captured Venezuela President Maduro from the Caracas on the same accusation. But Venezuela is not only corrupt country or export drugs to the US. The most corrupt countries include Bolivia, Nigeria, Sudan. And if we talk about a drugs export, then 90% of drugs goes to US from Mexico and about 5 to 10% from Venezuela. And by saying this all, I am not defending Venezuela. I 100% agree that there is lot of corruption in Venezuela and people will facing very serious problem there. But I want you to look at the real reason, which is not just unfair election or corruption in a country. The real reason is a decline of US dollar dominance, because Venezuela has 18 trillion worth of oil and they were trading 80% of its crude oil with China without use of US dollar, and this all was happening in a crypto. And if it had continued and countries keep ditching the US dollar like this, then the US dollar dominance would decrease and their power to put sanction on any country would become meaningless. So this is not just a fight for a corruption, this is a fight for a power. But Bitcoin had already started getting benefit from this fight. But how it will make Bitcoin even more stronger in the future and why dollar is failed in Venezuela, let's dive in this now. So there are many theories coming related to this, that how this all is connected to Bitcoin and how does Venezuela have 600k Bitcoin and how did dollar failed in Venezuela. But there is one theory that investor and Bitcoiner are believing to be true and it's becoming very famous. So tighten your seatbelts because we're gonna have some fun in the story. In 2017, the USA imposed restriction on Venezuela and their US dollar account got frozen by United States. And after that, in 2018, Maduro swapped 73 tons of gold for 2.7 billion US dollar. And according to theory, it was immediately swapped into Bitcoin so that US dollar account would not get frozen by the United States. And according to the Whale Hunt, the swapping happened at the average price of 5,000 per Bitcoin, and from that swap they had bought 400k Bitcoin. And between 2023 to 2025, Venezuela earned 10 to 15 billion dollars from exporting oil to the China, and this all transactions were happened in USDT. But when Venezuela found that USDT address could be frozen by Ether, then they immediately started swapping their USDT into Bitcoin. And from this swapping, it had been estimated that Venezuela had 600k to 660k Bitcoin, which is worth of about 56 billion to 67 billion dollar. But till now, there is no fully confirmed data available publicly that confirm that Venezuela really had that amount of Bitcoin. The public data show that Venezuela had confirmed in 2022 that they had only 240 Bitcoin, which is currently worth of $22.33 million. But theorists and analysts believe that this data is false because Maduro is very corrupt. He has hidden all those Bitcoin. Otherwise, where did all gold swap monies and money earned from oil goes? But whether Venezuela really had that much amount of Bitcoin or not, nobody really knows. But if they really had that amount of Bitcoin and that goes in a wrong hand, and if they sell them because Maduro is now in US custody, then this selling might collapse the whole Bitcoin market. But this is only theory, and what do you think about this theory? Please let me in a comment box. So now let's talk about how dollar failed not only in Venezuela but all over the world. In past, whenever US imposed restriction on any country, their economy used to collapse, like Iraq, Libya, Syria. But now that's not the case. People have alternative now. When the USA imposed sanctions on Russia, their economy also got badly hurt. Then the Russia started using Bitcoin, and such news came out that China and India was paying to Russia for oil in a Bitcoin. Therefore, in past, country used to fear that if US imposed sanction, then economy would collapse because the US dollar was the only option through which we could trade globally. But now country have a Bitcoin which is decentralized and they are using it to bypass US dollar sanction. And this is where the US dollar failing in Venezuela and in Russia. Therefore, countries are now starting to understand this, and due to which Bitcoin price has touched $94,000 as they realize that there is better second option. Therefore, if Bitcoin adoption increase in country, then Bitcoin will become even more stronger. But how will this dollar failure and USA Venezuela tension impact your investments? Let's dive in that now. Bitcoin price and dollar dominance have inverse relationship. In a simple term, if Bitcoin price increases, then dollar dominance decreases. And if you are American or Bitcoin investor, it's gonna impact you directly because the US dollar in 2025 has roughly lost 10% of its value. And if we talk about overall data from 1913 to 2026, it had lost 97% of its value. But to make this dollar strong and to make sure that dollar doesn't lose any more value right now, all countries need to do more and more transaction in a dollar. And this will happen when oil transaction between countries will happen in US dollar. So I hope you now understood why this actual invasion happened on Venezuela. But what will happen to oil in Venezuela and what will the US government do with it, nobody knows. But if oil transaction increase in US dollar, then US dollar dominance will also increase, which will bring the price of Bitcoin down. But the actual value of Bitcoin will remain same. Let me explain with you an example. Let's say you want to buy a house that is available for 1 Bitcoin. At that time, the Bitcoin value was 100k dollar. But after some time, if dollar dominance increases, the price of assets often goes down. So what will happen in that case? The things that was worth 100k dollar now will be available to you at 80k dollar. This will bring the price of Bitcoin down simply because the dollar became more valuable, but the value of that Bitcoin will don't change. It will remain the same. Whether the US dollar dominance increase or decrease, it might change the price of Bitcoin, but the value of the Bitcoin will remain the same. Therefore, dollar dominance won't affect much if you are invested in Bitcoin, but the message that the world had received from the land of Venezuela that the dollar sanctions can now be bypassed, this will bring a real growth to the value of Bitcoin. But the question which remains now, do those 600k Bitcoin really exist? And if it exists, how it will impact Bitcoin price if USA find them? Please comment down below. But if you have understood all this about US dollar failure, then you should understand the Japan bond trade, because there is even bigger problem for a Bitcoin in Japan than the US dollar. Watch this video.